It began on a quiet Saturday morning. I had just poured myself a steaming cup of coffee when my phone buzzed. It was my parents. They wanted to stop by the next day to catch up and spend some time with us. Being the straightforward guy that I am, I immediately said yes. It sounded like a nice, calm way to spend a Sunday, especially since family means a lot to me. After I hung up, I casually mentioned it to my wife, Lisa. She barely looked up from what she was doing, simply replying, "Okay, that's fine." Her reaction was unremarkable, and I didn't give it much thought. To me, it was just the beginning of another ordinary weekend. Later that afternoon, though, something unusual happened. I was sitting in the living room, scrolling through my phone, when I heard Lisa's phone ring. At first, I didn't think much of it. But her reaction threw me off. She practically leapt out of her chair, grabbing her phone as though the call was an emergency. Before I could ask what was going on, she bolted into the kitchen with her phone in hand. Her urgency made me curious, so I followed her. As I got closer, I could hear her voice, but she wasn't just talking softly, she was whispering. I couldn't make out what she was saying, and it was obvious she didn't want me to hear. I leaned against the doorway and asked, "What's going on? Who's calling?" She glanced at me briefly, waved her hand dismissively, and muttered, "I'll tell you later." Then she turned her back to me and continued her conversation. That didn't sit well with me. Why would she need to be so secretive? I lingered for a moment, debating whether to press the issue, but ultimately decided to let it go. I figured she'd explain when she was ready, or at least I hoped she would. I returned to the living room, but the uneasy feeling lingered. And her conversation dragged on, whispered words for nearly an hour. By the time she finally ended the call, I wasn't just curious anymore, I was irritated. "Who on earth were you talking to for that long?" I asked as she came back into the room. "And why were you whispering?" She looked at me with a casual, almost indifferent expression and said, "Oh, that was about tomorrow. We're going to have some guests." That stopped me in my tracks. "What do you mean, guests?" "My parents are coming over tomorrow. Did you forget?" She shrugged, as though it was no big deal. "Yeah, I know. But these are secret guests." Her words hit me like a brick. "Secret guests?" I repeated, incredulous. "You're kidding, right? Who are these people, and why are they coming here? Did you even think to tell me before you invited them?" She sighed, exasperated, like I was the one being unreasonable. "They're friends of mine, or, sort of. I met this woman online a few weeks ago, and we really clicked. She and her husband are coming to visit. They're unique. They have something exciting they want to share. Oh, and they're bringing us a special gift." I stared at her, dumbfounded. "Let me get this straight. 2 strangers you met on the internet are coming to our house, while my parents are here, and you think this is a good idea?" She nodded without flinching. "It's not that big of a deal. I already invited them, so it's happening. You'll see, it'll be fine." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. She had made this decision on her own, without consulting me, and now I was just supposed to go along with it. My jaw tightened as I fixed her with a hard stare, but I didn't say anything more. Instead, I turned and walked out of the room, my mind racing with questions. Who were these people? Why did Lisa think this was okay? And how was this supposed to play out with my parents there? Something about it didn't sit right. I had a sinking feeling that this wasn't going to end well. Sunday came quickly, and with it, my parents arrived right on time. True to form, they were punctual and impeccably dressed, my mom holding a homemade pie and my dad wearing his usual reserved expression. They're the kind of people who value tradition and propriety above all else, and I've always admired that about them. I hoped the afternoon would be a peaceful one, filled with pleasant conversation and family bonding. As they settled into our living room, everything seemed to be going smoothly. My mom complimented the new curtains, my dad asked about work, and Lisa appeared content, even cheerful. For the first hour, it was calm and almost enjoyable. But in the back of my mind, I kept glancing at the clock, silently praying that Lisa's so-called secret guests wouldn't show up. Maybe they'd change their minds. Maybe the universe would intervene and spare me the headache. Then, as if on cue, the doorbell rang. The sound felt like a sledgehammer to the fragile peace we'd managed to maintain. My dad turned to me, raising an eyebrow in silent question. "Are you expecting someone else?" he asked. Before I could answer, Lisa was already halfway to the door. "Oh, I forgot to mention," I said, trying to keep my tone neutral, though I could feel my stomach tightening. "We'll have more company today." My dad's brow furrowed, the lines on his forehead deepening. He's a man of few words, but the look on his face spoke volumes. My mom, ever the composed one, sat up a little straighter, her curiosity piqued but her alarm carefully hidden. Meanwhile, I felt like a weight was settling in my chest. This was going to be a disaster. I could feel it. Lisa opened the door, and there they were, Herb's secret guests. They were impossible to miss. The woman was dressed in bright pink tights, a miniskirt that looked like it belonged on a teenager, and a crop top that barely covered anything. Her husband wasn't much better, ripped jeans, an old rock band t-shirt, and hair that hadn't seen a brush in days. They looked completely out of place, like they'd wandered off the set of some low-budget sitcom. Lisa greeted them with a sparkle in her eyes that I hadn't seen in years. She looked thrilled, as if royalty had just arrived. I, on the other hand, turned to glance at my mom. Her face had gone pale, and my dad's expression had shifted from mild curiosity to complete disbelief. Before I could even process what was happening, the couple stepped inside, grinning ear to ear, and introduced themselves like this was the most natural thing in the world. They carried a large, brightly wrapped gift, which they placed on the coffee table with great ceremony. "We brought something special for you all," the woman chirped. Lisa beamed and began unwrapping the gift, clearly excited. But the moment I saw what was inside, I knew it was a mistake. The box was filled with items that I won't describe in detail, but let's just say they were completely inappropriate for a family gathering. My father's jaw tightened, and my mother looked like she might faint. I grabbed the box, muttered a strained "thanks," and carried it into the hallway, as far from my parents' sight as possible. When I returned to the living room, the tension in the air was almost suffocating. My father, ever the disciplinarian, tried to make polite conversation, but it was clear he was struggling to maintain his composure. My mother, who hates confrontation, sat frozen, clutching the armrest like it was a lifeline. Meanwhile, the guests seemed blissfully unaware of the awkwardness they'd caused. They smiled, whispered to each other, and acted completely at ease, as if they were among old friends. Then came the moment that sealed the disaster. The man leaned forward, his expression serious. "Remember how we talked about making a big announcement?" he asked, turning to Lisa. She nodded eagerly. "Yes, go ahead." He smiled at the room. "Well, we've decided to open up our marriage, and we thought this would be the perfect time to share that with everyone." The room erupted. My father, who had been holding his tongue all evening, could no longer contain himself. "That's not openness," he snapped. "That's adultery. Plain and simple." What started as a tense exchange quickly escalated into a full-blown argument. Voices rose, tempers flared, and the once civil gathering devolved into chaos. My mother sat frozen in her seat, her face a mix of horror and disbelief. The guests tried to defend their lifestyle, but my father wasn't having any of it. At one point, he stood up and said, "If I were your age, I'd knock some sense into you. But I'm smarter than that, so we're leaving." I hurried to escort my parents to the door, apologizing profusely as they left. My father gave me a look I'll never forget, a mix of disappointment and disgust. No words were necessary. The shame I felt was overwhelming. Once they were gone, I stood at the door for a moment, staring out into the night and wondering how things had gone so horribly wrong. Then, with a heavy sigh, I turned back inside, bracing myself for whatever would come next. As the door closed behind my parents, I turned to find Lisa and her friends, acting as if nothing unusual had just happened. The couple sat on the couch, chatting quietly, while Lisa began pulling items from the infamous gift box and setting them up on the coffee table like it was some sort of bizarre display. I couldn't believe my eyes. My parents had barely made it out the door, and she was already acting like their embarrassment didn't matter. I stood there for a moment, watching in disbelief before turning to the couple. "You couldn't have picked a worse time to bring this up," I said, my tone cold and clipped. "Why would you think announcing something like that in front of my parents was a good idea? And now you're making it even worse." Lisa shot me a sharp glare. "Stop ruining what's already ruined," she snapped. "You're not making things any better by harping on it." Her defiance caught me off guard. Before I could respond, she grabbed my arm and pulled me into the kitchen. Once we were out of earshot, she folded her arms and stared at me like I was the one causing the problem. "This can't go on," I said through clenched teeth. "You invited people into our home without consulting me. They caused a huge scene with my parents, and now you're acting like it's no big deal. This has to stop." Lisa rolled her eyes, dismissing me as if I were overreacting. "You're being dramatic. Things will settle down. Let's just get through the evening." I felt my patience wearing thin, but I decided not to escalate things any further, for now. I kept my distance for the rest of the night, sitting quietly while my thoughts raced. Who were these people, and why had Lisa let them into our lives? What kind of chaos had she dragged us into? Later, as we sat in awkward silence, I decided to address the practical matter of their stay. "So," I began, looking directly at the couple, "when are you planning to leave?" For the first time all evening, they seemed caught off guard. The husband exchanged a look with his wife before responding. "Well," he said, his tone casual, "we were actually hoping to stay here for a while. You know, just until we get back on our feet." I stared at him, stunned, then turned to Lisa, expecting her to shut this nonsense down. To my horror, she didn't hesitate. "Of course you can stay," she said brightly. "We have plenty of room." My stomach dropped. Was she serious? I managed to keep my composure, but inside, I was fuming. The couple wasted no time making themselves at home. They even disappeared into the bathroom together, laughing like they didn't have a care in the world. Meanwhile, I turned to Lisa, my frustration finally boiling over. "Do you even realize what you've done?" I asked, my voice low but intense. "First, they disrupt everything with my parents. Now, they're planning to stay here indefinitely, and you're just letting it happen." Lisa shrugged, completely unfazed. "Your parents overreacted," she said dismissively. "And what's wrong with being hospitable? They needed a place to stay, and we have space." Her nonchalance was infuriating. But before I could argue further, she added, "Besides, tomorrow is going to be great. When you get home, you'll see. You'll love it." Her confidence only made me more uneasy. That night, we went to bed while the couple slept on the couch. At least, I thought they were sleeping. Around midnight, I was jolted awake by noises coming from the living room. At first, I tried to ignore it, hoping they'd quiet down. But the noises only grew louder and more unmistakable. I lay there, seething, unable to sleep, as the realization of what they were doing hit me. Right there in my living room. The audacity was staggering. I knew the next day would bring even more chaos, and I dreaded every second of it. The following morning, as I got ready for work, I turned to Lisa, barely able to contain my frustration. "If this happens again, I'm throwing them out," I said firmly. "I don't care what they say or how it looks. They're out." Lisa waved me off like it was nothing. "Oh, stop being so dramatic," she said with a roll of her eyes. "By tonight, you'll feel differently. Just wait and see." Her dismissive attitude only made me angrier, but I didn't have the energy to argue anymore. I left for work, already dreading what I'd come home to. As I drove to work that morning, I tried to push the tension from the previous night out of my mind. I focused on the tasks ahead, hoping the day would provide some relief from the chaos brewing at home. But by the time I returned that evening, my hope for peace was shattered before I even reached the front door. Thumping bass from loud music poured out of the house, so loud it could be heard from the driveway. My heart sank. This couldn't be real. I stepped inside and was met with a scene that could only be described as madness. Strangers were everywhere, spilling drinks, laughing, and dancing like they were at some wild house party. The living room was packed, the furniture shoved aside to make room for people who had clearly never stepped foot in my home before. My sanctuary had been invaded, and I hadn't even been consulted. To my surprise, a few familiar faces were mixed in with the crowd, friends of mine, looking as uncomfortable as I felt. One of them approached me as soon as I walked in. "Hey man," he said, his voice low. "I don't know whose idea this was, but it's not what I expected. There's some guy walking around pitching open marriage to people. It's weird." My blood boiled. "Where's Lisa?" I asked, my voice tight. He shrugged. "Haven't seen her in a while. Honestly, we were about to leave. This whole thing feels off." That was all I needed to hear. I pushed through the crowd, scanning faces and dodging spilled drinks as I searched for Lisa. Strangers stared at me as I moved through the house, but I ignored them, too focused on my mission. After searching every room downstairs and finding no sign of her, I headed upstairs, dread pooling in my stomach. Finally, I found her in the bedroom, sprawled across the bed, passed out drunk. She looked completely oblivious to the chaos unfolding downstairs, and the sight of her lying there made my stomach churn. This was my wife, the woman I'd vowed to build a life with, and here she was, unconscious in the middle of a disaster she had clearly facilitated. I stormed back downstairs, anger fueling every step. "Party's over!" I shouted, loud enough to cut through the music. "Get out! Now!" At first, some people laughed, thinking I was joking. But I wasn't in the mood for games. I said, "Get out!" I bellowed, my voice sharp with fury. My friends stepped in to help, ushering the guests toward the door. Bottles clinked as they were knocked over, and chairs scraped against the floor as people scrambled to leave. Within minutes, the house was empty, except for Lisa's beloved friends. The couple had the audacity to stay behind, lounging on the couch like they owned the place. The husband stood up and approached me, his tone apologetic but insincere. "Look," he began, "we didn't mean for things to get out of hand. We're really sorry. But we've got nowhere else to go. Our landlord kicked us out, and we thought we could stay here for a bit while we figure things out." I stared at him, barely able to contain my anger. "That's not my problem," I said coldly. "You've overstayed your welcome, and you've crossed every possible line. Get out. Now." They tried to argue, but I wasn't listening. My patience had run out. I said out, I repeated, my voice leaving no room for negotiation. Defeated, they finally gathered their things and left, muttering empty apologies as they went. Once the door closed behind them, I let out a long breath, staring at the mess they had left behind. Empty bottles and food wrappers littered the floors, the furniture was sticky from spilled drinks, and the house reeked of beer. It was like a tornado had ripped through my home. I grabbed a trash bag and started cleaning, too wound up to sit still. As I worked, my thoughts raced. How had it come to this? How had my life been turned upside down in such a short amount of time? But the real question loomed larger. What was I going to do about Lisa? She had brought these people into our lives, defended them, and stood by while they destroyed everything. As I tossed another broken bottle into the trash, one thing became clear. We were going to have a serious conversation. And it wasn't going to be pleasant. The next morning, I woke up feeling worse than I had the night before. The stress, the lack of sleep, and the mess of the last few days had finally caught up to me. My head throbbed, and my body felt like it had been through a war. I called in sick to work, deciding I needed the day to regroup. The house was eerily quiet as I shuffled out of bed. Lisa's side of the bed was cold, and when I checked the kitchen and the living room, she was nowhere to be found. Immediately, suspicion flared. Where was she? And why hadn't she told me where she was going? I grabbed my phone and called her. It rang a few times before she finally answered. "Hey," she said casually, as if nothing was wrong. "I'm at my friend's place. Don't worry, everything's fine. I'll be back soon." Her dismissive tone only fueled my irritation. "What do you mean you're at a friend's? Where exactly have you been all morning? And why didn't you tell me?" She sighed, sounding annoyed. "Calm down. I'll explain when I get home." And just like that, she hung up. My fists clenched around the phone. The audacity of her casual attitude made my blood boil. When she finally walked through the door a few hours later, I was ready for her. I had spent the morning cleaning up the wreckage from the party, taking photos of the mess as evidence. Now, it was time for answers. I laid the photos out on the dining table like I was presenting a case in court. "This," I said coldly, pointing to the images, "is what I came home to last night." I expected to find some semblance of normalcy, maybe even a quiet evening. Instead, I walked into chaos. "And where were you?" "Passed out upstairs while I had to kick out those freeloaders myself." Lisa crossed her arms and frowned. "I noticed," she said sharply, "and honestly, that was really mean of you. They needed help, and you threw them out like they were trash. It wasn't fair." Her words hit me like a slap. Not fair. I repeated, incredulous. What's not fair is you inviting strangers into our home without my consent. What's not fair is you keeping me in the dark about all of this. And what's definitely not fair is you expecting me to clean up the mess they left behind while you— What? Go play the hero. She rolled her eyes, clearly unimpressed with my argument. Fine. You want to know where I was? I was helping them find a new place to stay. And for your information, they're going to live with my friend now. So there, problem solved. Her smug tone only irritated me further. Problem solved, I said, my voice rising. You didn't solve anything. You just pawned them off on someone else. Do you even understand the kind of trouble you've brought into our lives? For a moment, she hesitated, but then her expression hardened. You don't understand, she said firmly. I've been talking to them for weeks. They're good people. They've just hit a rough patch. I met them on this online forum about personal growth and success, and they're working on this amazing course that's going to help so many people. I even took their course, and it changed my perspective on life. They said I was incredible, and we became friends. But they've had some issues with their studio, so they needed somewhere to stay while they worked on a new program. That's all this is. I stared at her, dumbfounded. Let me get this straight, I said slowly. You took some online course, befriended the instructors, and decided it was a good idea to let them live with us, without asking me? She didn't flinch. Yes, she said bluntly. And honestly, I think you're being dramatic about this whole thing. They even offered us a chance to invest in their next course. The returns could be huge. My patience snapped. Invest? I barked. Absolutely not. We're not giving them a single cent. They've done nothing but disrupt our lives since they got here. And another thing, I added, pointing a finger at her, you're done talking to them. I don't care what they promised you or how much you believe in their crap. You're cutting ties with them. End of discussion. Lisa's eyes narrowed, her expression a mix of anger and disbelief. You can't just tell me who I can and can't talk to, she said, her voice shaking with defiance. Watch me, I replied, my tone firm. Then I turned my back on her and walked out of the room, leaving her standing there fuming. The rest of the day passed in icy silence. Lisa sulked in one corner of the house while I finished cleaning up the aftermath of yet another disaster. But no matter how spotless the house became, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over, not by a long shot. 3 weeks passed, and life seemed to return to some semblance of normalcy. The house was quiet, the nights were undisturbed, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I could come home without bracing myself for chaos. I started to believe that the storm had passed and Lisa might have finally learned her lesson. I let myself relax, even finding some comfort in the familiar routines of daily life. But peace, as they say, is often the prelude to a new storm. One evening, I came home after a long day at work. As I walked through the door, I could hear Lisa on the phone. That wasn't unusual, but there was something in her voice, an excitement, an animation, I hadn't heard in a long time. I called out a quick greeting, which she barely acknowledged, too wrapped up in her conversation. Shrugging it off, I made my way to the bathroom to wash up. As I stood there scrubbing the grime of the day off my hands, a nagging thought crept into my mind. Could it be them again? The couple who had turned our lives upside down not so long ago? I shook my head, trying to dismiss the idea. Surely Lisa wouldn't make the same mistake twice. Surely she'd learned her lesson. But as the minutes ticked by and the phone call showed no signs of ending, my unease grew. Finally, I decided to confront her. I walked into the living room just as she was hanging up, her face lit up with excitement. Before I could say a word, she turned to me with a wide grin. You won't believe this, she said, practically bouncing with energy. I've had so much time to think over the past few weeks, and I've realized something. The reason I've been feeling stuck, like I'm in a rut, is because I haven't been working. I raised an eyebrow, unsure of where this was going. Of course, I said cautiously. I've been saying that for a while now. Work gives you structure, purpose, and it'd help with the finances. She nodded eagerly, as if this revelation was entirely her own. Exactly. And guess what? My friend just offered me a job. She's coming over tomorrow to explain everything. That caught me off guard. A job? I asked, cautiously optimistic. What kind of job? Lisa shrugged, clearly unbothered by the lack of specifics. She didn't go into a lot of detail, but it's remote and the hours are super flexible. Sometimes I'll need to go to the office to submit reports or meet deadlines, but most of the work can be done from home. It's perfect, don't you think? Her excitement was infectious, but the vagueness of it all set off alarm bells in my head. Still, I decided not to jump to conclusions. I guess that depends on what it actually entails, I said carefully. When she comes over tomorrow, we'll hear her out. Lisa's enthusiasm didn't waver. It's going to be great, she insisted. I'm finally going to have something meaningful to do. You'll see, this is going to be a game changer for both of us. I gave her a tight-lipped smile, still skeptical but unwilling to burst her bubble just yet. All right, I said, nodding slowly. Let's see what your friend has to say tomorrow. Go ahead and invite her over. Despite my reservations, I knew there was no point in arguing about something that hadn't even been fully explained yet. For now, I'd play along. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this than she was letting on. The next day, Lisa and I spent the morning tidying up the house in preparation for her friend's visit. She was clearly excited, going out of her way to make everything perfect. I approached the situation with cautious optimism. While I was glad she was considering work, the nagging doubts in the back of my mind refused to go away. By early afternoon, the house was spotless, the table was set, and we were ready. The doorbell rang right on time. I opened the door, and there she was, Lisa's friend. To my dismay, it was the same woman who had hosted the troublesome couple weeks earlier. My stomach tightened instinctively, but I kept my face neutral. She greeted us warmly, far more composed than during our last encounter. Lisa, practically beaming, ushered her into the living room. We exchanged polite small talk at first, but I was impatient to get to the real reason for her visit. Eventually, I decided to address the elephant in the room. So I began, keeping my tone casual, about that couple who was staying with you. How's that situation going? Her response was swift and firm. Oh, I kicked them out weeks ago, she said, her tone matter-of-fact. They weren't what I expected, and I realized they were taking advantage of me. Don't worry, they're not my problem anymore. Her straightforward answer was enough to put me at ease, at least for the moment. If nothing else, it seemed she had learned her lesson. With that out of the way, we shifted to the real purpose of her visit. She laid out the details of the job she was offering Lisa. The responsibilities sounded reasonable. Working remotely to process applications, submitting reports, and occasionally handling payroll tasks at the office. The pay structure included a base salary plus commission, and as far as I could tell, it seemed legitimate. I glanced at Lisa, who was hanging on every word. She looked thrilled, her enthusiasm lighting up her face. That sounds great, I said cautiously. And everything's above board? Her friend smiled reassuringly. Of course. We've been running this for years. It's a great opportunity, and I think Lisa will be fantastic at it. Lisa nodded eagerly, ready to dive in. It's perfect, she said. I can finally do something meaningful. Not wanting to dampen her spirits, I decided not to press further. All right, then, I said, nodding. Sounds like you've got yourself a deal. Lisa threw herself into her new job with surprising enthusiasm. She set up a workspace in the corner of our living room and dove into her tasks with a focus I hadn't seen in months. For the first time in a long while, she seemed genuinely energized and purposeful. The house felt different, too, calmer, more structured, and I couldn't help but feel a cautious sense of relief. Maybe this really was a turning point. About a week into her new role, Lisa approached me with more news. They're having a little office party next week, she said, her tone light and cheerful. It's just a small gathering to celebrate some milestones. I'll need to go into the office for it. I nodded, seeing no harm in it. That sounds reasonable, I said. Just let me know how it goes. She smiled brightly. Actually, they're planning something special for me at the party. A little surprise. So don't worry if I'm out late, okay? Everything's going to be great. Her excitement was infectious, but there was something about her tone that made me uneasy. Still, I didn't want to dampen her mood. All right, I said, trying to sound supportive. Have fun. The day of the party came and went without incident. Lisa left in the late afternoon, dressed in her best, practically glowing with anticipation. I went about my evening as usual, figuring she'd text or call if anything came up. But by the time I went to bed, she still wasn't home. It wasn't until the next morning that I finally got the notification that would turn my world upside down. I was at work, focused on the usual tasks, when my phone buzzed. At first, I thought it was a routine alert, but when I opened the banking app, my stomach dropped. Nearly all the money in my account was gone. I stared at the screen in disbelief, refreshing the app over and over, hoping it was some kind of glitch. But the numbers didn't change. Panic set in as I tried to piece together what had happened. Was it fraud? Had my account been hacked? Or was it something worse? I excused myself from a meeting and immediately called the bank. After several agonizing minutes on hold, a representative finally came on the line and confirmed my worst fear. The transactions were real, not a mistake. Someone had emptied my account. My mind raced as I tried to figure out what to do. I told my boss I needed to leave, and thankfully, he didn't ask too many questions. I jumped in my car and drove home as fast as I legally could, my thoughts spinning with possibilities. Had Lisa's new job somehow been a scam? Was she involved, or had she been duped? When I walked through the front door, I didn't have to wonder anymore. The answer was right there, waiting for me in our bedroom. Lisa was there, but she wasn't alone. The man from the infamous couple, the one who had wreaked havoc on our lives weeks ago, was with her. They were caught in the act, and the sight of them together made my world tilt on its axis. My hands shook as I pulled out my phone and started recording. I didn't trust myself to speak without evidence. Lisa screamed at me to stop, but I ignored her. I needed proof of what I was seeing. Once I had enough, I set my phone down and opened the drawer of my bedside table. Inside was my firearm, something I kept for emergencies. The situation felt surreal as I pulled it out, my movements deliberate and measured, despite the storm raging inside me. I pointed the gun at the man, my voice eerily calm. "What the hell are you doing in my house?" He stammered, his hands raised in surrender, while Lisa begged me to put the gun down. "You don't understand," she said, tears streaming down her face. Before anyone could defuse the situation, the man made a sudden move toward me. My instincts took over, and I fired. The bullet hit him in the stomach, and he collapsed onto the floor, groaning in pain. The sound of the shot echoed through the house, followed by a deafening silence. Lisa screamed, her hands covering her mouth as I reached for my phone to call the police. Within minutes, officers and paramedics arrived. The man was rushed to the hospital under police supervision, and I was taken into custody to give a statement. They confiscated my firearm and assured me that the incident would be thoroughly investigated. Once the chaos settled and we were alone, I turned to Lisa, my anger finally boiling over. "What the hell were you thinking?" I shouted. "What's going on?" She tried to compose herself, but her voice trembled as she spoke. "Before you judge me, just listen," she pleaded. "I've been unfaithful. Not just with him, but with others. 6 others, to be exact. And I've realized I can't stop. It's something I enjoy, something I need. That's why I'm proposing we open our marriage." Her words hit me like a freight train. I stared at her, unable to process what she had just said. Open our marriage? After everything she had done? "Get out," I said coldly, my voice devoid of emotion. "Take your things and get out of my house." "No." To my surprise, she didn't argue. She calmly packed a bag and walked out the door without so much as a backward glance. Once she was gone, I locked every door and window in the house, ensuring no one could disturb the fragile solitude I had reclaimed. As I sat down on the couch, exhausted and emotionally drained, one thing was clear: this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The next morning, I woke up feeling like I was in a fog. My mind reeled from the events of the previous day, and the silence of the house felt oppressive. As I moved around, trying to make sense of it all, my eyes landed on Lisa's laptop, sitting on the dining table where she'd left it. It was a glaring reminder of her presence, even though she was gone. Something compelled me to open it. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was the desperate need for answers. I powered it on, and within seconds, the screen came to life. The desktop was cluttered with folders, but one immediately stood out: It was labeled with the name of the program Lisa had been working on for her so-called job. I clicked on it, and what I found was worse than I could have imagined. File after file revealed the truth. This wasn't just some harmless job, it was a well-organized scam. And Lisa hadn't been an innocent participant, she had been deeply involved. As I delved deeper, the pieces began to fall into place. There were chat logs, emails, spreadsheets, enough evidence to paint a damning picture of deceit. The couple, who I thought had disappeared from our lives, hadn't been kicked out by Lisa's friend as she had claimed. Instead, her friend had been a willing participant in their schemes, working with Lisa and the couple to orchestrate this elaborate con. Lisa's role? Processing applications and, worse, accessing people's financial information. The thought of her being involved in something so malicious made my stomach churn. One email thread in particular caught my attention. It was a conversation between Lisa, the couple, and her friend. They discussed their plans openly, as if they had no fear of being caught. They joked about how easy it was to manipulate their victims and bragged about the money they had made. Then I saw it, a message about me. It outlined a plan for Lisa to leave me eventually, but not before draining as much money as possible from my accounts. My jaw clenched as I read their cold, calculated words. This wasn't just betrayal, it was predatory. Further digging revealed exactly how they had pulled it off. Lisa had memorized my account details and used our shared devices to authorize transactions without raising suspicion. She had exploited the trust one placed in her, and for what? To enrich herself and these con artists. What angered me most was their arrogance. They had left a digital trail as if they thought they were untouchable, chat logs, spreadsheets, even screenshots of victims' bank accounts. Their carelessness became their undoing. Lisa had been so confident in her new life of deceit that she hadn't even bothered to cover her tracks. I closed the laptop, my anger turning to resolve. This wasn't just about me anymore. These people had hurt countless others, and it was time for them to face the consequences. I picked up my phone and called my attorney, laying out everything I had discovered. "We need to meet," he said firmly after I finished explaining. "Bring everything you have." We set a time to meet later that day, and as I hung up, I glanced at the laptop one more time. Its dark screen felt like a looming shadow of everything that had been lost: my marriage, my trust, my financial security. But as devastating as it was, I knew one thing: this wasn't the end. This was the beginning of a fight to reclaim what was mine and to ensure that these people couldn't harm anyone else. Over the next few weeks, the pieces fell into place with startling clarity. My attorney and I worked tirelessly to compile the evidence, building a solid case against the scam operation. The files from Lisa's laptop, combined with financial records and victim statements, painted an undeniable picture of fraud and betrayal. We presented everything to the authorities, and they wasted no time taking action. Warrants were issued, and the arrests came swiftly. The man from the couple, who was still recovering in the hospital, became the first to crack. Under interrogation, he confessed to everything, implicating Lisa, her friend, and the rest of the group. His testimony aligned perfectly with the evidence we had gathered, solidifying the case against them. Their plan had been bold and reckless: wait for the heat to die down, then disappear before anyone could catch them. But they hadn't anticipated someone like me, someone determined to hold them accountable. Their overconfidence became their downfall. Within days, the police apprehended the remaining members of the group, including Lisa's so-called friend, who had been instrumental in coordinating the scams. Watching them face justice was both satisfying and bittersweet. While it wouldn't undo the damage they had caused, it felt like a small measure of vindication. As for Lisa, her situation was bleak. She was arrested and granted one phone call. Of all people, she chose to call me. When I answered, I was met with a tirade of anger and accusations. "You ruined my life," she screamed. "You couldn't just let me go, could you? You had to destroy everything." The irony was staggering. Here she was, a woman who had betrayed me, stolen from me, and destroyed the life we had built together, now playing the victim. I didn't let her finish. I hung up mid-sentence, her voice still ringing in my ears. The divorce proceedings that followed were swift and decisive. With all the evidence on my side, the court granted me full ownership of the house, the car, and the majority of our assets. Lisa was left with nothing but the consequences of her actions. As the courtroom drama ended, I allowed myself a moment to breathe. It felt like the end of a long, grueling chapter. But even as I walked away from the courthouse, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't truly over. Lisa and her accomplices might be out of my life, but the scars they left behind would take much longer to heal. Thank you for visited my YouTube channel. Your support, likes, and comments truly inspire me to create even more engaging content. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. You're a part of this amazing community, and I'm thrilled to share my stories with you. See you in the next video on YouTube.